One freshman Congresswoman silenced Bill O'Reilly, stood toe-to-toe with Elizabeth Warren, and left the Senate chamber forever changed. This wasn't just an interview. It was the moment Washington realized a new force had arrived. The Capitol chamber was wrapped in a silence that felt alive, a silence so thick it pressed against the walls and crawled into every corner. This was not the quiet of peace but the quiet that comes before thunder. Bill O'Reilly sat at the long polished table, posture sharp, his expression carved from stone. His eyes scanned the room with a kind of clinical detachment, like a man measuring his opponents before the first strike. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her palm steady against the desk, her dark blazer crisp, her gaze unflinching. She was young, untested in the eyes of Washington's old guard, but the stillness in her body betrayed none of that doubt. She was ready, even if no one in this room wanted her to be. The senators around them shifted in their chairs, some curious, some impatient, others outright dismissive. To them, this was supposed to be routine, a hearing like hundreds before, where voices rose, words collided, and then everything slipped back into the endless machine of bureaucracy. But tonight, something different vibrated beneath the marble and chandeliers. The stakes weren't about policy lines or party victories. This was about power itself, the kind of power that shapes presidencies, bends Congress, and redraws the Constitution in silence. Everyone could feel it, even if they refused to admit it. When Jasmine finally opened her mouth to speak, her words cut through the chamber like the crack of a whip. She didn't plead, she didn't soften. She called upon the Constitution as if it were not paper but a living force, a shield that had been abandoned too long by those sworn to guard it. Her voice carried the weight of history, reminding the senators that every time they had looked away while the executive branch stretched its authority, they had betrayed their oath. It was not the tone of a freshman desperate for approval. It was the tone of a prosecutor delivering her opening argument in a trial where the guilty already knew the verdict. Reporters in the press gallery jolted upright, their fingers stumbling across keyboards as they scrambled to capture her words. Even O'Reilly, master of provocation, allowed himself a faint smirk. He recognized the danger in her rhythm, the way she pulled the Constitution down from its pedestal and thrust it into the faces of those who had treated it like decoration. It was bold. It was reckless. And it was working. For the first time that night, the senators leaned forward, not to dismiss her, but to listen. The storm had not yet broken, but its first lightning bolt had struck. Crockett's words were the signal, the opening shot in a clash no one had anticipated. What was meant to be another performance of Washington theater was suddenly transforming into something raw, something electric. The old order had stirred awake, but so had something new, and the tension between them promised that this chamber would not leave the night untouched. The silence after Jasmine Crockett's words didn't last long. A rustle of papers, the squeak of a chair, and then came a voice, sharp, seasoned, impossible to ignore. Elizabeth Warren leaned forward, glasses catching the light, her eyes fixed not on O'Reilly, but directly on the young Congresswoman. The room shifted. What was meant to be Crockett versus the Senate suddenly became something far more dangerous. A test from within her own ranks. Warren's question struck like a blade. Calm, deliberate, but merciless in its precision, it asked whether Crockett truly understood the implications of her defiance, whether she realized she was accusing not just presidents, but Congress itself, of surrendering its soul. The words hung heavy in the air. It wasn't a trap laid by enemies. It was a challenge thrown by an ally, or perhaps a gatekeeper deciding whether Crockett was worthy of standing among them. For a heartbeat, the chamber froze. Some senators smirked, certain the freshman would falter. Others leaned in, curious to see if she would rise or collapse under the weight of Warren's intellect. Reporters whispered to each other, sensing the shift in narrative. This was no longer the story of a young lawmaker interrupting tradition. This was a duel of generations, of ideals, of two women standing at the sharp edge of constitutional truth. Crockett did not flinch. She met Warren's gaze, her jaw set, her hands folded before her as if steadying herself against the storm. When she spoke, her tone was firm, deliberate, neither defensive nor deferential. She admitted the truth plainly. Yes, Congress had neglected its duty, and yes, that failure had consequences. Each word was delivered with the weight of inevitability, as if she were pulling back a curtain everyone had pretended wasn't there. She didn't apologize. She didn't retreat. Instead, she accused, turning Warren's challenge into an indictment of the very institution surrounding them. The chamber stirred uneasily. Senior lawmakers exchanged nervous glances, uncomfortable with hearing their complicity spoken aloud on the record. Some scowled, others shifted in their seats, but no one interrupted. Because deep down, they all knew she was right. And in that moment, the balance of power in the room shifted once again. Jasmine Crockett wasn't simply answering Warren. She was forcing the entire chamber to answer to her. The tension in the chamber thickened, the air almost electric. Senators shifted uncomfortably in their leather chairs, some pretending to read their notes, others stealing glances at the confrontation unfolding before them. Cameras zoomed in, capturing every flicker of expression. What had begun as a routine hearing now felt like a stage for history. Bill O'Reilly, sensing the drama, leaned back with the faint trace of a grin. For years, he had thrived on moments like this: conflict, pressure, the scent of political blood. Yet even he could not predict how the young Congresswoman would wield her words. Elizabeth Warren's question had been sharp, meant to corner, to remind the freshman lawmaker of her place. But Crockett's reply was not the panicked defense of an unseasoned politician. It was something different. Something dangerous. She spoke with the steady cadence of someone who had lived in courtrooms, where every word carried weight and every pause could decide a life. Her voice didn't rise, but it cut clean through the noise. The real betrayal isn't mine. It's Congress's silence while the executive claimed powers that were never his to take. The sentence landed like a hammer, reverberating against the marble walls, echoing in every senator's chest. The press gallery erupted in a storm of scribbling pens and frantic whispers. For reporters, this was no longer politics, it was theater at its most raw. A freshman taking on her own party's elder, accusing the Senate of cowardice, and refusing to play by the unspoken rules of hierarchy. Some called it arrogance. Others saw bravery. But everyone agreed, it was unforgettable. Elizabeth Warren, usually unshakable, blinked for the briefest second. She adjusted her glasses, buying time, her expression betraying a flicker of unease. The silence that followed was almost unbearable, as if the entire chamber waited to see whether she would strike back, or yield ground to the rising force across from her. And in that silence, Jasmine Crockett's power grew. For a moment, the entire chamber seemed to stop breathing. Elizabeth Warren's usually unbreakable composure faltered ever so slightly, her lips parting but no words coming. The cameras caught it, the hesitation, the brief flash of uncertainty. For a politician whose career had been built on mastery of debate, it was a rare, human crack in the armor. The senators around her shifted in their seats, some startled, others secretly amused. They had expected a rookie to fold under the weight of Warren's authority. Instead, they were watching something almost unthinkable: a freshman lawmaker not just holding her ground, but forcing a titan of the Senate to pause. The balance of power in that grand room had tilted, if only for a breath. Reporters in the gallery scribbled furiously, capturing every detail. To them, this wasn't just another policy discussion. It was drama that bordered on myth. A young trial lawyer turned congresswoman had entered a chamber filled with decades of entrenched power and declared, without hesitation, that the emperor had no clothes. She hadn't raised her voice, she hadn't insulted anyone. And yet, the calm clarity of her words carried more force than any shouted speech. Warren adjusted her glasses again, a practiced move to mask the momentary loss of footing. When she finally spoke, her words were careful, measured, an attempt to reclaim the narrative. But the energy had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. The freshman had turned the hearing into a duel, and Warren, consciously or not, was now playing on her terms. The silence that followed Crockett's accusation had been deafening. But what mattered most was what came after, the realization, whispered first in the press box and then muttered among the senators themselves, that Jasmine Crockett was no ordinary freshman. She had crossed an invisible line and emerged stronger. In Washington, that kind of moment doesn't just happen. It marks the beginning of something larger.